Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Hi everyone, welcome again back to Simple Living, High Thinking. I realize that I've not been doing a very good job of introducing everyone who, in case anyone is just listening on the podcast. So once again, I'm joined by Tadeo Souza Prabhu and Varangi Radha Devi Dasi and myself, Kim Pullander. So we are towards the end of chapter 2 today. So I'm just going to open up the conversation. What do you guys want to talk about? What is there any sort of background or setting that you think we should give, or any talking points that you guys wanted to bring up today? I'll just leave it open-ended.
One of the talking points I had in mind is that I was contemplating after yesterday's class is related to the experience I had when I first read one of Prabhupada's book, which title was The Science of Self-Realization. And I was very intrigued by that title because science and spirituality, as it is generally known in the West anyways, doesn't really go together. They're oftentimes opposed to each other. And scientific approach, however, it's something quite objective, right? So I was very intrigued about the possibility of merging the two. And I had been looking for this scientific approach. And when I read Gita for the first time, towards the end of the second chapter, which is what we're talking about today, based on yesterday's class, this text that we started with yesterday, text 62, chapter 2, text 62, and 63 together, to me, it was, this is the scientific part. Because it's such a hypothesis that if you follow, you will know it's true. If you contemplate your life and your experiences throughout life, you cannot deny the truthfulness of these verses. And I also believe it's cross-culture. Right, it's true for us in the US, it would be true for South America, Asian countries, European countries. No matter if you are a human being on planet Earth, these two verses will be objectively true and therefore quite scientific.
Could you read them?
Yes. So text 62, Krishna says, while contemplating the objects of the senses, a person develops attachment for them. And from such attachments, lust develops. And from lust, anger arises. From anger, complete delusion arises. And from delusion, bewilderment of memory. When memory is bewildered, intelligence is lost. And when intelligence is lost, one falls down again into the material pool. So let's just break it down a little bit, right? Contemplating the objects of the senses. So a beautiful sunset is a visual object from a sense of sight. The smell of a rose is an object for my nose, right? For my sense of smell. So in this way, every material object that my senses can capture, collect data from, these are the objects of the senses. So while contemplating them, a person develops attachments. So when we think about something long enough, we get attached to that something. In my personal experience is about a year ago, actually, not quite a year yet, my family and I made our first trip to Hawaii. And Hawaii is always held in such high regards for its beauty, etc. And I've never been there. And now that I've been back, oftentimes I catch myself and my wife at dinner table, like, oh, remember when we blah, 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 fill in the blank in Hawaii. And we're like, oh yeah, that was so nice. And the beach and the sunsets and the warm weather and how relaxed people were, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're just contemplating the objects of the senses, because that's what we got there. A lot of sense enjoyment, right? And sure enough, while contemplating them, we develop attachment. So then now it's like, okay, when can we go again? So that's like an attachment that I have for Hawaii now, which I never had before. And from attachment, lust develops. So as Tukaram Prabhu defined yesterday, this lust is usually used to describe your sexual desires, right? But in this sense here, Krishna is using it in a more broad sense. So the lust that is being developed here now is like a really strong attachment. It is no longer just, oh yeah, the ocean breeze was so nice, but it's now like, when can we go again? Like, let's actually get some, like, take a look at our finances, book the plane ticket. In my case, you know, let's wait for the kids to be off school. So like you actually start like really getting attached to it. Like it's a strong attachment, is this lust. Like I gotta have it right now. And then from lust, anger arises. Well, what does that mean? Yesterday, we treated this in class a little bit, and we can expand on that today also. To me, I really like to always keep in perspective that spiritual life isn't something boring. It's not that we are neglecting our enjoyments to just be some kind of sad sadhu, you know, with no entertainments, no enjoyments of any kind. And therefore, when we start talking about negative aspects of material life, I really try to be careful with that and not give a sense in which that's what material life is about, neglecting the enjoyments of material life. It's not. It's actually about attaining a higher enjoyment, which is spiritual. But anyways, in order to do this here, it's not, this is just a warning. We're going to get real here now. So this is material life. So what does it mean that from lust, anger arises? It arises because when we have desires that transforms into lust, there's 3, maybe 4 possibilities that will happen in life. Either A, we will get that thing, and that thing will not satisfy us as much as we thought it would. In other words, our expectations will not be fulfilled. Let's say you go to Hawaii and it was raining every single day we were there. So then it's like, ah, bummer, you know, my expectation was not fulfilled. That is certainly a possibility. And the other possibility is you don't actually get that thing. With you know, kids are not off school, or there's a pandemic going on, and even though I had my plane ticket booked, I can't go anymore because everybody's freaking out about coronavirus, right? So then I can't go. So then I'll be angry about that. If I'm there, it's raining every day, I'm angry about that. But even in a more positive note, let's say I do go there, then my trip is going to end because we are in time, and then I have to come back, and that again, I may be angry, right? So those are the possibilities of the outcome of any of our material attachments. In other words, you'll never be truly a happy ending, and therefore we're going to get angry. So anger is going to arise from that lust, and then from anger, complete delusion arises. That's when we get really bent out of shape, right? Oh, it didn't work out, or it didn't fulfill my expectations. Well, you know, we're going to move into a new place, and then, oh, things is going to be wonderful when we move into a new place. But now that things aren't organized as we like them to be, we're like what happened to all that planning, all that projecting? Oh, when we have our nice place, it's going to be so cool. And I'm speaking not only from my dear friend's experience here, Varangi, who just moved, but also myself. I just moved, you know, about a month and a half ago. And I'm like 95% happy here. There's 5%, which is like, But before that was such a long time that we are thinking about moving and how to be a bigger place, et cetera, right? So anyways, then you get bewildered. It's like, it's not happy, like I didn't get the bang from my butt. Then this is very interesting, right? From such bewilderment, then bewilderment of memory. So that I thought was very interesting how we spoke about that yesterday. We lose our memory because now everything we know is no longer accessible to us. We know better. We know that we are spiritual beings. We know that I'm not supposed to be super brain out of shape if it's raining in Hawaii, or if there's a pandemic and I can't go. I know that. I know that this is the nature of the material world, but still, my memory is not going to be there. All my lessons are not going to be available and accessible to me, which then causes me to lose my intelligence. So then I am now really open for anger, deep anger, and resentment, and envy, pettiness. And that's because my intelligence is not there. All the spiritual intelligence that we have, it's not part of how we're going to act right now. And when that intelligence is lost, we again fall into the material pool, which for a spiritualist, that's the worst outcome. Material pool here being, like say, birth and death and sufferings that we experience in material life, which is to say that now we are lost again in material existence, just suffering, right? And to me, this was an extraordinary description of my experience in life. And anybody I know, for that matter, everybody goes through this cycle. I would invite anyone who is listening to this podcast to do this mental experiment and see if this holds true for you. And I guarantee you will. So to me, this is a very scientific explanation that Krishna is giving here, because this is the hypothesis, and now let's do the experience and see if it is true for us. It certainly has been for me.
Yeah, you make a really good point. Thank you for summing up those verses, those texts. I was really, I found it very interesting how Tukram Prabhu pointed out the aspect of memory, where memory is our intelligence and it is our enlightenment. And I thought, yeah, because, so I'm back in school right now, and I often think like, oh, I wish I had a photographic memory and then I'd be smarter. And then I was thinking, well, then the smart people in the world are the people who have the best memories. And so, yeah, it's interesting. Like if we hear all this great instruction and learn from these sacred texts, but if we don't retain any of it, then where's our spirituality? Where's our enlightenment? It's just gone. So.
Yeah, wonderful point. I thought thank you for bringing that up. I thought I also, to a lesser extent, was impacted by that section. And I say lesser extent because I still think that whatever I expect and whatever I want to get, that will actually give me a lot of enjoyment until it happens and I'm in it. I'm like, oh yeah, I remember the Gita said that this usually happens. And so one of the things that I was thinking about was, it's so interesting that Krishna doesn't drop this like at the beginning of chapter 2. He drops this scientific method to explain how the soul gets entangled in the material world after he has explained Sankhya, which is the difference between body and spirit, and after harmonizing this knowledge with yoga or action, right? Which then the harmonization is buddhi yoga, buddhi meaning intelligence or enlightenment. And so through enlightenment action, which means knowing Sankhya, right? Knowing that you're not the body, that you're a spiritual being and acting in this world, then you're not attached to the results. And so this process that Sosa Prabhu just mentioned, that was just covered, really actually comes after Krishna explains and lays out the basics, right? And I was thinking, imagine if I would have heard this before he explained what, like, that categorization or that division of life, between the differentiation between matter and spirit. I would just be like, okay, I can't do this. Like, what do you mean? Like, I'm in this world. What am I supposed to do? Like, not be attached to anything? That sounds so weird, and it sounds so unnatural. And it sounds like this person is just so repressed and like doesn't want to have any connection with anybody, which is what everybody wants to do, right? Even spiritualists. Like, I think Tukaram brought this up last night, but we see our teachers who are masters at this bhakti yoga practice, how they actually feel so deeply, and they're actually so committed, and they're actually so real and so human in a lot of ways, but at the same time they're so advanced in spirituality. And so I guess I'm bringing up this point because if we were only to hear this section without, being reminded of everything Krishna has presented this far, and not only Krishna, but what Arjuna is going through, then it's harder to really understand the bigger picture. And so it's something that Tukaram Prabhu does every class, and we do that as well when we're studying, which is thinking of the recap of where we're at, what has been just said, what has been explained, and in this way we could really see that helix in which Krishna's teaching. Otherwise, it could just be so bewildering, thinking, well, okay, this is a new teaching, and then only focusing on that, not really considering everything that has been explained. And so I really appreciated that this was such a heavy and confronting piece of information, but at the same time, it's not just on its own, and it's not in a vacuum. It's really based on the knowledge that we're not this body, and that we should still act in this world, but by not being attached to the results of our action, then we could really learn how to not be attached to those senses. To the object of the senses. So we have senses, we have to act in this world. We're in a human body. We have families, a lot of us, work. And so we have to act, and action is actually a prerequisite in Bhakti Yoga, which is actually one of the biggest themes also that has been introduced, that grace is there, that Supreme Person is helping us through this path, but we have to also want it, and we also have to be willing to walk this path, and not perfectly, but just try. And so I appreciated that, and it's something that when you were going through this process, that just came to mind, like, wow, this is so wonderful and is so scientific, but also it's not just like, hey, you should do this, this is like how you don't get attached. It's like, no, attachment is not that it's bad, but it's bad when we are putting our faith and our expectations on something that by definition is a fallible soldier, which is something that Tukaram used that terminology last night, and it really like hit deep. It's like, wow, it really puts into perspective how many things or people in my life I depend on in such an absolute way, which is codependent. That was another topic that came up last night. Anyway, last night's class was really wonderful, but this is just one of the things that really came to mind right now when you were going through the scientific process of how we get attached to the wrong things and how much we suffer, and how by that process we lose our intelligence. And intelligence is buddhi. So that's exactly what we want to protect, right? Once we are purified enough to obtain some type of level of enlightenment in intelligence, then we could actually act in this world in the right way, I guess. Do you have any comments about that, Prabhu?
Yeah, I have a comment, and I think what you brought up is that we are discussing here contemplating the objects of the senses, and in one sense this is everything we do, because from the time that we wake up to the time that we go to sleep, we are using our senses to interact with the world, and naturally we're going to contemplate one of them. And this verse is actually saying, hey, this is absolutely bad. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but what you brought up is that, hey, this is not being spoken in a vacuum. is being spoken after we have been told that we are not the body and the soul, and that as such, we can act as a yogi, which is to do our duties but not be attached to the results. But also something else that came up before this, right? That we can also contemplate something else, which is how Krishna suggests that we get rid of those bad habits of being attached to material things, which is to attach our consciousness to him, and that would be the higher taste. And that by experiencing the higher taste, we now can more easily let go of the lower taste, which in this case is the material objects. Is that correct?
You totally nailed it. I don't think I finished that thought.
Mm-hmm.
You totally did that for me. Thank you. That's exactly it. And I think this is something so beautiful in our tradition, that it's like the do's and the don'ts. And the don'ts are not really there to repress us. And this is something that in that verse 64, it's something that stood out to me. It's talking about the regulative principles of freedom. We talked about this 2 podcasts ago, and you mentioned the regulative principles and how by not doing something, you're actually strengthening something positive or cultivating a positive quality in yourself. And I was thinking, wow, yes, this tradition not only gives us the don'ts, or it's like, don't do this, don't do that, but it's like by not doing this and you doing something that is the total opposite, you're developing more transcendental qualities, and your intelligence is really being distilled and purified. And so this concept of achieving more freedom through regulation is really revolutionary. Like, it's something that I've never heard of before until I started learning about this tradition and this practice. And yeah, what you mentioned, so it's not just not engaging, but it's engaging with the source of everything, right? Because that source actually is the only thing that can fulfill us. And so it's learning through that scientific method, what are the things that actually gives us satisfaction and happiness and we can actually trust, and what are the things that are fallible, that are temporary, that are never going to fulfill us. Even if when we do get some fulfillment, it's temporary, like you explained. And so yeah, it's mind-blowing how regulation is being introduced in this text, verse 64, as a tool by which we could protect ourselves from degradation. Yeah. And how that can make us, actually not make us, but really help us become free. Like, doesn't that sound kind of like the opposite? It's like, oh, by you regulating your senses, your mind, by not just fully indulging in everything that you find attractive, by doing that regulation, that control, you're actually going to become free and happy and satisfied, which is then, I think, a metaphor that Krishna gives later on. And I think that's verse, I want to say 69, no, 70. Where
not
he,
disturbed by the incessant flow of desires,
yes,
that enter like a river into the ocean.
Is that 70?
Yes.
Wonderful. Yeah, it's that metaphor. It's like it's not saying that we're not getting desires. We are, because we're in this world. But it's like such a wonderful example Krishna gives. It's like the ocean is not affected, even though so many rivers are coming in incessantly, constantly, right? So the desires for the spiritualists are also coming, but the mind of the spiritualist doesn't get disturbed.
Now I gotta finish the text. So, a person who is not disturbed by the incessant flow of desires that enter like rivers into the ocean, which is ever being filled but is always still, can alone achieve peace, and not the man who strives to satisfy such desires.
Yeah. And I think that nails it. It's like, it's not that that's not happening. It is happening, and the desires are coming through, but it's like, I almost get that image of a spiritualist being like watching the thoughts and desires and all these attractive things, but he's just like, okay, that's a good one. Okay, oh no, that's not a good one. And it always be having in mind the purpose. Like, what's my purpose? Is this self-realization? Okay, that's a good one. If my purpose is self-realization, that's not going to help me. So you let it pass. And so I just thought that metaphor was just like so wonderful. It just really paints a clear picture of the life of a spiritualist that is still part of this world, but doesn't degrade himself or herself by trying to satisfy everything that he or she comes in contact with. And so, yeah, it's brilliant, that presentation. It was helpful.
Yeah, and last night I was very encouraged, I guess, or inspired when Tukaram Prabhu mentioned how the Gita is such a practical guide for spirituality. You know, it's like it's real world advice. Whereas when I first started reading the Gita, I had this impression like, oh, it's such lofty ideals that I'll never be able to relate to. But it's really a very practical handbook, so to speak, for how to navigate the world. So if you were to talk to someone who's just picked up the Gita for the first time and is hearing, okay, it sounds very nice to be able to detach from, oh, being obsessed with my boyfriend or wanting to get this new job. And okay, so we're supposed to seek for something higher, have a higher taste. How do you begin to just make that small shift into focusing on Krishna? What does that look like to be able to start to make those choices? And Varangi, you just made a really good point about it is a choice in life. You know, we're not animals. You know, Tukaram Prabhu frequently mentions, you know, compares us to the specialness, I guess, of being a human, where we have the ability to love God versus an animal just following, you know, these
Instincts.
Yeah, instincts. So I guess my question is for both of you. Is there any advice you have for how to start to, what that looks like for starting to focus on Krishna?
Well, I would start just like Krishna did, like, because that's the supreme person, and who better than Krishna himself? And there's no defect with what Krishna did. Perhaps the advice would be maybe unpacking a little bit more of what Krishna said, but I would certainly start by saying, hey, you are not the body, exactly like Krishna did. Because only when you're not the body, you can then realize that, well, if I am not material and I am spiritual, then you would naturally follows that only that which is also spiritual can truly satisfy me, because I am spiritual by nature. I'm not material. If I am seeking for material things, they're going to come with a defect. And that's a fact. So for somebody who is beginning their spiritual life, that's lesson number one. And it's you can blow a lot of people's mind if you never heard that. And also when we say we're not the body, let's keep in mind here that our tradition has a very broad and specific definition of what that means. Broad in terms of spirit and matter, right? It's just two things. It's very broad. But now, when it comes down to break down what the body means, let's keep in mind that mind, false ego, and intelligence is also in the category of material things, which we are not. They're subtle matter, but they're matter nevertheless. And therefore, the knowledge and the understanding, the enlightenment, one could say, that I am not this body, which comes with that mind, with that intelligence and that false ego, is also part of who I'm not. And only with that understanding, I can then do what Varangi Mataji just pointed out, which is like an extraordinary thing, that you step back from those thoughts, because those thoughts are going on at your level, at the level of your mind. But if you don't even have awareness that you are not your mind, you're truly thinking, I am these thoughts, and therefore I am the desires that comes with those thoughts. And my only goal in life is to fulfill them. What other goal is there? The measure of my success is how well have I been able to fulfill my desires. And they're all at the mental level. But if I know that I am not that I'm a spirit, soul, and I can take a step back and watch those thoughts in front of me, and just pick and choose which one I'm going to engage on or not. Wow, that's powerful. Like I would, unfortunately, I would say that probably 90% of the people on this planet doesn't know that. They're really thinking
So
I am these thoughts, you know? So I would start there, like really bringing that point home, just like Krishna did. I am not matter, which comes with the mind as well. And therefore, what is truly in my best interest? Perhaps one could say the famous question, who am I? And where do I come from? I'm a spirit soul. Where do I come from? The spiritual world. And therefore, that's where my true fulfillment is. So then I would start with that. Like, we're truly, really, we're not the mind, you know, we're not the body. That's a fact. I would start there and then unpack that from whatever questions may come, you know.
wonderful. Yeah, I loved your answer. I think I would also start there. One thing we could do obviously is remember how the Gita is being presented. At this point, Krishna hasn't even introduced himself as God, you know, so at this point the conversation is pre-theistic. So I think even before we start asking, or for somebody like your question, like what you asked, Kim, specifically, even before we ask somebody, well, focus on God, it's like asking these basic questions. And before that is really seeing how Arjuna, what kind of person he is. I think this was really powerful for me. It's like reading that first chapter and the beginning of the second chapter, where he's having that breakdown and that existential crisis, and at the same time understanding how elevated he is as a person, was really impactful for me. It's like, wow, so somebody even that is so pious, somebody that has faith, somebody that's like super honorable and is living such a exemplary life, can also go through these moments. Well, that's something I want to read about, because I go through this all the time and I'm not even half the person this guy is, you know. And so I think that the first thing I would look at, or invite somebody to look at, is let's study who Arjuna is. I mean, he's going through something that I have definitely been through. You probably have too, or you will for sure at some point in your life. And there's a lot more work that we probably have to do to even get to his level, obviously, for sure, most of us. And so I know this is a topic that has been brought up so much up to this point, which is the end of the second chapter, which is how to become qualified to receive knowledge. So Sosa Prabhu brought up the point of the importance of knowledge, which is really where anything starts. You can't, you know, if you go to AA, it's like you can't really start the process of the 12 steps unless you admit that you have a problem, which means you have knowledge of your problem, you accept it, and so you choose to step into rehab, if you want to think of it that way. And it's non-different for spirituality. So yeah, I think that in order for us to be able to receive knowledge, which is the first step, there's no way we can change if we don't know why we're changing, or why we need to change, or who we are for that matter, which is why it's so important, the point you just made. But also, well, what kind of person do I need to be? Not like you have to change who you are, but what are the qualities that will enable me to really hold what's about to be poured into me, which is something that was brought up again last night in class, but which has been brought up every class since the beginning of the first text in chapter 1. And so we see that Arjuna is a man, a person, a personality that lives a life of honor, of integrity, somebody that's super sincere, highly intelligent, and we know that by the types of questions and arguments he poses. He's also deeply thoughtful and introspective. He's also very compassionate, and although at some point he does exhibit selfishness, we understood that that's a very important point or a very important position from which we can start, because we can only understand things by what's nearest to us and then branch out. And so even though he does go there, he then upgrades to like dharma, like what's the right thing to do, what's best for everybody else, so their families, what's best for the world at large. And then he gets to a point, which I believe is verse 7 in the second chapter, where he just actually turns it over to a teacher, to Krishna, and he says, hey, I don't know what I'm doing, can you please help me, like instruct me, let me know. But so I think that that's a great way to start, you know, just following the Gita and seeing what is worth investing in, what qualities do we really need to start developing. And I would say, you know, sincerity, determination, truthfulness, like being really just honest about where we're at, what we need help with, and just wanting to be vulnerable, finding somebody that knows more than we do to then give us that knowledge. And it not only happens by just asking. This is something that I don't think was brought up in the Gita, definitely not up to this point, but it's something that is brought up in our other books and literature. And please, Sosa Prabhu, correct me if I'm wrong. But we are told that in order for us to receive knowledge, in order for us to receive, I guess, grace in the form of teachings and instructions, is something that comes before that. It's a mindset and an attitude of service. Okay, I'm here, I don't know anything, I want to learn, what can I do for you? Meaning like our teachers and people that can help us. And so that's something that comes before we are then able to grasp and hold that knowledge. And so by becoming a good student, being able to hear properly, and then putting into practice what then is giving out of just love and mercy by our teachers, then we're able to really start that path. Otherwise, whatever we hear, I don't think it sticks, you know, if we haven't done a little bit of work, and we are not open to surgery, I guess, to put it that way. And so I really appreciate the fact that this tradition isn't so cheap, that anybody could just be like, well, whatever, let's see, if Krishna's actually God, then then I can get a mansion on the beach, or I can, you know, let's see if you actually exist. It's not that cheap, you know. It's actually, it requires a little bit of work at the beginning, a little bit of faith to start the process, a lot of vulnerability and wanting to learn, a lot of learning how to listen, a lot of wanting to do some service, which is just, what can I do to repay this unpayable debt of transcendentalism and spirituality? How can I be a part of a community? How can I plug in? What do I need to work on myself? And then once that knowledge starts flowing, I think the biggest test, and I think I would like to hear about this from both of you, I think the biggest test is when that knowledge does come, is, am I applying that knowledge, you know? And I'll share a little bit about that, and just how that just manifested for me. Last night during class, I didn't know how to recap. And this is something that Tukram goes through every class. And I could see how disappointed he was, and how most of us didn't know how to answer that question. And it's not that it's beyond our capacity, because he's actually chewing all that up, and he's just spoon feeding it to us, you know? And of course, I had many reasons. Like, I wasn't in class last week because I was moving. I had so many other things going on. I mean, there's so many reasons. But the point is, I'm getting this knowledge. And yeah, on a good day, I'm like, yeah, I really appreciate this. This is changing me. This is transforming me. And like, I'm making progress. But I think the real test is those little moments where it's like, are you holding this information? Are you remembering this information? And how can I be putting that into practice if I can't even remember it? And so that was really like, I felt really embarrassed, and I felt like I wasn't living up to the level of, to what I present myself to be, you know, like, oh, I'm really interested in this tradition and these topics, and I love to study, but I mean, obviously not that much if I haven't really been studying for the past week or 2 weeks for whatever reason. And so we really make time for those things that are important to us. And so this was a wake-up call for me. And this is how I realized, and this is just an example, but I would like to hear from both of you maybe how this may manifest also in your life, how I really realized how the real test is, what am I doing with that knowledge when it's coming my way? Obviously it's all the time that's flowing our way now. Are we putting that into practice? And if we're not, then what's the use, you know? And then if we're not doing that, then now's the time to wake up and like make some changes. And that's the beauty of spiritual life. I don't think it's something static. I don't think it's something that you just do on Friday night, or I just do on Friday night, and then that's it. It's something that you can practice every day and make changes every day, and you get to be slapped with the stick of truth every day, and be grateful for that, you know, as opposed to like, who, what does this guy think he is? Like, I have a full schedule. But just like, oh, thank God somebody cares about me that much. Like, they actually want me to learn this. And so anyway, I'll stop now, but I thought this was an embarrassing time in my life, and especially in my spiritual life, and I definitely wanted to put myself out there to like be held accountable. So yeah, I don't know what you guys, do you guys have any thoughts about what the biggest test is when it comes to taking knowledge, and like actually what that looks like? I don't know if that's the right question. Maybe you.
So let me jump in here, and then I'll be very curious to hear from you too, Kim. Well, two things here, Varangi. I think number one, you answer Kim's question, like what would we say to a newcomer? And I think you brought up a very good point, which is to analyze who Arjuna was, and in that sense, try to mirror ourselves in his personality. I think it was an excellent point you brought up. And by doing that, like verse 64 is really highlighted by what you're saying here, because on verse 64, Krishna says, but a person free from all attachments and aversion and able to control his mind through regulative principles of freedom can obtain the complete mercy of the Lord. So Krishna is actually standing right next to Arjuna. So certainly Arjuna has already obtained the complete mercy of the Lord, because Krishna is standing right in front of him, right? And obviously then it is implied that Arjuna has been able, or at least prior to him breaking down, to control all of his senses and act in the honorable way that you described. And Krishna then will come in and help us through this. We are not alone. It is not that we have to fight against this seemingly undefeatable monster of material nature alone. Krishna will help us. And that's why I think it was so brilliant what you brought up in answering Kim's questions, because yes, we have to have the knowledge, which is what I pointed out, but also let's be the type of person that Arjuna was. And if we are that person, then we can attain the Lord's mercy, which is really how we make progress, is to Krishna's mercy, not any merits of our own. Our only merit is to control our senses through the regulative principles of freedom, which is not only powerful, but very poetic as well. Paradoxical, powerful, and poetic, you know, and this is really what we do. So I thought it was very nice that you brought that up, because it is absolutely important for a beginner to keep that in mind as well. Now, moving on to your, as you say, putting yourself out there and feeling down on yourself for not being able to recap the lecture, the class Gita yesterday. First of all, I know we're having this talk here in public, but I'll share part of things that I know of you since we've been in contact for a long time
Oh, God.
with each other. You, I believe, due to the humility you have cultivated in spiritual life, which is an extraordinary quality of yours, tend to very much underestimate your capabilities. And you would, I have no doubts. I would, we don't bet as devotees, but if I wasn't a devotee, I would bet my money with anybody that you would do an extraordinary job of recapping chapter 2 or any chapter of Bhagavad Gita for that matter. And it would just be a matter of you start speaking. And I think it's the extraordinary respect you have for Tukaram Prabhu, as we all do. And we don't want to disappoint him. And we want to say something that is powerful to honor him, his presence. And we may be a bit shy. But if you were to right now recap chapter 2, you would do an extraordinary job, and I have no doubts of that. Now, having said that, not speaking to you personally now, but to anybody who may feel that, well, I have this spiritual knowledge and I now need to be able to act on it and capture it and have it available for me. And why is it that it may not happen? Why is it that I'm not studying as I should? Why is it that I'm not as prepared as I should? I think there's a simple explanation to that. And again, it's, it's part of the thoughts I had. In fact, I was discussing this point with my wife this morning, that we don't really believe Krishna is a person. We don't really believe Krishna exists and that he's a person and that we are persons, and that the most fulfilling experience we can have in our eternal life is to love Krishna. We are seduced by this lesser enjoyments of material nature, and therefore we don't want to read about him, and therefore we don't know all Gita by memory, and therefore we again get seduced by lesser things. Just like Krishna already said, if you don't have a higher taste, you're going to be seduced by the lower taste. We don't really know Krishna is a person. I mean, we know it, we've heard it, we've read it, we spoke about it, but how much of that do we really internalize it? Do we really embrace it? Do we really accept Krishna is a person? Just like the beloved people in our life, he's a person. And he's dear, he loves us more than we love anybody. And that we, because we also have a spiritual nature, we can engage in a loving relationship with Krishna. And what does that mean? How would that make us feel? The contentment of our hearts would be extraordinary, much better than Hawaii. And I think a lot of our shortfalls, a lot of our shortcomings in spiritual life is when we lose track of that. He's our best friend and he exists as a person and we can have a relationship with him. And when that is not in the forefront of our mind, something else will be. And then we come up with excuses of things and so on. And I speak like that because I've experienced that myself. When I'm really contemplating Krishna as a person, as my best friend, as being here with me, as the one who loves me the most and care for me more than anybody else, and is just waiting for me to open the door a little bit so that he can pour his mercy into my consciousness and my existence. Wow. Like he deserves my everything, my every second. But it is when I'm start thinking about Hawaii or my business or the next home or whatever, then it's like, oh, that person kind of fades away. And I'm back here in the material world,
What a great point. Yeah, I think having a personal relationship it's a big responsibility. Like you actually have to interact, you have to make time, you have to give yourself, you have to be ready to also receive them. And it's like it requires being more conscious, like so many things. So it's so much easier to be like, oh yeah, this is just a book, or yeah, this is just a personality, like a character, but not really like a person in our life, much less the supreme person. That's such a great point.
I've heard one of our teachers, Ridayananda Goswami, talking on this point. somebody asked him a question. It's like, hey, I've been in Krishna consciousness for a while, and I love it, I enjoy it, but chanting is so difficult. Like, what can you teach me to help me? And his answer was so powerful. It's very connected to this. He said, when you come to Krishna consciousness and you start dancing on kirtan, that's wonderful. You are with the people you like in your spiritual community, and you're dancing, and everything's so beautiful. The deity is right there. Everybody's happy. You are seen by others. You see others, and that's great. When you are in Krishna consciousness and you're taking prasad, wow, that's wonderful, because that prasad takes phenomenal. You're usually with your friends, and it's a public gathering, and you're seen by others, you're seeing others, and it's phenomenal. Who wouldn't do that? And then he went on, like if you're reading a book and you are an intellectual person, it's like, wow, I'm entertaining my mind. All these concepts are blowing my mind. And that too is fun. And then he went over just about all these spiritual activities that we cultivate, that we engage in. And in all of them, there is something that you're getting. There's like some kind of sense gratification to you. You are in community with others. You're entertaining your tongue by tasting prasad, etc. And then he said, but when you sit down and chant, it's just you and Krishna. That's it. And if you don't love him, you're not going to enjoy it. Because why would you spend 2 hours sitting there with a person that you don't even like? You could be doing so many other things. You could be having prasad. You could be, engaging in kirtan, and all those things would be fun, because it's not just you and Krishna. There's something else that's in it for you. There's something else that is entertaining you, subtle or otherwise, But when you chant, you would only enjoy chanting if you truly love Krishna, because it's just you and him. You're not being seen by anybody. There's nobody there to appreciate how spiritual you are. And there's nothing else. You're not eating, you're not dancing, you're not reading. You're just repeating his name. And the only
It's
way
our chance to give, huh?
the only way for you to enjoy that is for you to truly love him. And as long as we don't love him, chanting is not going to be a fun activity. We're going to have a hard time chanting. And that is so true. And that's the way I see disconnected with the point we're discussing now, is that yes, Krishna is a person. And if I don't love that person, I'm not going to sit and chit chat with the person for 2 hours every day if I don't love them, So I think when we start lacking in our spiritual practices, it's always, I wouldn't say always, I guess I can say, in my experience, the majority of the times when I see myself lacking in my spiritual practice, I'm lacking that conviction that Krishna is a person, and that he loves me, and that I can love him, and that he's right there,
And the first place where that manifests is in our japa, huh?
Yes.
The quality of it. Wow.
Right, because like you're going to sit down and you're just going to say his name for 2 hours or an hour and 45 minutes. How can you do that? You're going to have to remove yourself from all of your material engagements. I know your nature, Varangi, and you are very much loving towards your family. So you have to have a real good reason to remove yourself from the presence of your beloved ones here, to then just spend those 2 hours with Krishna. So it's just you and him. It's just you and Krishna. And you're never going to enjoy that unless you truly love him, which is, is a very good point. So yeah, I think when we start forgetting that Krishna is a person, he has feelings, he loves us, then our spiritual practice will decline.
Wonderful. Thank
Yeah,
you.
that's such a good distinction. That's really interesting about Krishna being a person, because for me, coming from a conservative Christian childhood, this idea of God being very fear-based and angry and not someone I necessarily want to have an intimate relationship with, moving into present day of this all good God. I once asked Tukram Prabhu in a class, how do you have an intimate relationship with God? Because the concept was so foreign to me, like, okay, an intimate, loving relationship, what does that even look like? And his answer was basically, had a lot of the components that you just mentioned, both of you, about association. You find people who have that love, that intimate, loving relationship with God. You, by mere association with them, you're inspired by them. You learn from them. You do your japa. You do your prasad, you know, the association, and through that process in time was basically the answer. Just like, you know, if I met you today for the first time and I wanted to have an intimate, loving relationship with you immediately, you know, that's like it was my left brain completely taking over in that question to Ram, where it's like, no, okay, this is a process. We're talking about a person, and how do you cultivate that intimate relationship? So you got, both of your answers to these questions were so inspiring today. It was really, really helpful, really valuable. So we are near the end of our time together. So are there any closing thoughts that you guys, either of you, would like to add before we sign off?
Varangi?
Nothing. I love this time. I love this time to get together and talk about these things. Yeah, there's always going to be something that can fill up our time. There's always going to be something that seems to be so pressing and so important and so urgent in our life. And I guess this has been in the forefront of my mind lately because I've been a little busier on my material aspect of my life, and that is very important. But it's really also helped me realize how lucky I am to be able to take care of that, but also have something that really fills me up, fills my cup, you know, and also an opportunity to give back. And it really ties into the last thing you said, Soza, about, you know, japas when it's just you and Krishna and God and the Supreme. You know, it's for me, that represents a time where I get to practice how to give without looking for something like an immediate gratification, you know. Just like I think 90% of my time I spend it in things that are just immediate, not gratification, what is that called? Immediate, yeah, like you get something back right away. And so during our spiritual practice, it's really based on a relationship. It takes time, it takes commitment, and it's like a gradual process. And so, yeah, I'm feeling really grateful and inspired for this time that we get weekly. I can't wait to start doing it live, so we get some questions and we get to like expand, and it's wonderful. You know, it takes a lot, at least for me, to carve out this time. But then once we're in it, it's like, oh my gosh, I don't want this to end. And so sadly we do have to stop, but there's just so many other topics that we can bring up about the second chapter, and I can't wait for the third chapter, which is starting next week. And yeah, to recap it and remember where we're at and continue on and just build up our arsenal of spiritual tools. And I'm really gaining so much from these conversations, and being able to just dissect everything after hearing Tukram is like really helpful, because then we get to speak about it, and it just kind of like, I feel like, oh yeah, this makes sense, or this is what I need to work on, or I'm doing better at this. And so I hope that you're also having a good experience. I'm sure you are. So thank you. I just wanted to express my gratitude.
Of course. My pleasure. It's just, I feel the same way about our time here on a weekly basis. It's very helpful, it's very inspiring. And I'm very grateful for it. My closing remark here is that we were discussing earlier how we are told by Krishna not to contemplate the objects of the senses. So in that way, to really be thinking about material things, because we know that the result will be bad, as Krishna just mentioned. But that we touched a little bit today on this point, and it will certainly become very profoundly evident that it is one of Krishna's and Gita's main teachings, that we can also think of Krishna. It's not that he's just telling us, oh, don't think about things that are material and leaving us alone. Krishna will instruct us farther in Gita, perhaps one of the strongest verses there is, to think of Krishna always. So the very thing we do, which is to engage our mind in something, is not that we have to artificially not do that. No, we still do it, but we do it towards the Supreme. We do it towards Krishna, in that we can contemplate Krishna and be attached, have Krishna be the object of our senses, and develop attachments, dare I say, even lust for Krishna, and in that way, engage in what's natural. That's what we do anyways. That's what our mind's constantly doing, but we just do it in that intelligent way, and that is possible. So to just have the knowledge that Krishna as a person is an object, he can be the object of our senses, and engage our senses in a very natural manner in that way, in thinking of Krishna. And this is perhaps one of the reasons why I'm so grateful about Krishna consciousness, because there's so much information about him. There's in Bhagavad Gita, in Srimad Bhagavatam, in Chaitanya Charitamrita, all these different scriptures. Sorry for mentioning things that we haven't discussed yet, but the other scriptures that we have, there's Krishna's complete autobiography from the time that he appeared in the world to the time that he disappeared in the world, all the prominent things he did, the way he treats his devotees, the way he engages with his devotees. There's so much to think about him. And we'll put to shame any movie, any Romeo and Juliet, any Star Wars, any Titanic, any Odyssey, anything. Nothing will stand to the honor, to the love, to the romance, to the action, to the adventure, to the excitement of Krishna and his pastimes. So we can read, so we can think about him and be attached to him.
Very nice. That was actually one part of Tukram Prabhu's answer to my question about an intimate, loving relationship. He said, talked about the Sanskrit word lobh, I believe, which is greed, and you have to develop greed for Krishna. So it's nice.
Yes.
Well, thank you both. I meant to mention this at the beginning of the podcast, but we were unpacking last night's class from May 8th. In case anyone wants to go back and listen to that, we'll include links to that. So thank you for listening, tuning in, watching, and share the podcast with your friends and subscribe if you like it. And we'll see you next week. So thank you. Thank you both.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Thank you for joining us on Simple Living, High Thinking. Please subscribe as new episodes post every Monday. You can tune into this podcast live every Saturday at 3 p.m. Pacific Time. Check out our website for more details at simplelivinghighThinking.net. And if you would like to nominate someone for a devotee spotlight interview, contact us via our website at simplelivinghighThinking.net.